Welcome to today's lecture. The title of this lecture is It's All About the UI. In this lecture, I believe that the most important take-home message that you should have is that the UI is what the customer sees. It is the public face of the software. If the UI doesn't work very well, then it doesn't really matter how good the rest of your software is. People just won't use your software. There's enough choice available in terms of all sorts of apps and applications and software today that nobody needs to use badly designed software. Keeping this in mind, in this lecture we're going to talk about what actually happens when users are confronted with bad user interfaces and why this is actually such a big problem. We'll also discuss why good user interfaces need to be considered to be essential. They're not optional at all, and it's really important to remember that too many software development projects start with the functionality and then worry about bolting on a user interface. This is the really important bit. Pretty much any software that needs to be used by people must consider how people will use it. So just so you know how this lecture is actually structured, here's an outline of the topics that we'll be covering during this class. On this course, in every single lecture that we've recorded, we've provided you with a list of online resources. It's very important that you look at these because you're in class-based tasks and your coursework really does require you to read around the topics covered in this material. User interface design actually involves thinking about the whole implementation process as an iterative one. It is actually very important to factor in enough time to evaluate the user interface with real users at various stages during the development process. Because if you don't, then you're likely to end up with some nasty surprise further down the line. The thing is that you might have some rough idea of how the system should work in somebody's business, but then when you actually deliver it to the users might say, well, we don't actually work that way. And so suddenly you've got a problem because you haven't factored in how the users actually work in the business process. So the first thing that you actually need to be willing to accept is that you won't actually get the user interface right the first time. It has to evolve over time as you get a better understanding of the requirements and the needs of the software product and its users. If you only evaluate your interface towards the end of the implementation, it's almost always extremely costly to fix that mistake. If you can spot those kinds of issues early on in the process before you've invested a huge amount of time and effort in coding, then you're going to save yourself a lot of effort in the long term. Good design offers some very, very apparent benefits. It actually makes users' tasks very easy, and the interface supplies appropriate feedback about what's going on. It provides users with a good user experience, and people find the software pleasing to use. When your users are happy, they'll continue to use your software. At the moment, today, graphical user interfaces facilitate the use of computers and technology everywhere. There are graphical user interfaces even in your TV sets. Think about where we might actually be without graphical user interfaces at the moment. How would you check today's weather or find your way to a place to visit a friend that's moved home? We use UIs all the time. In some very exceptional cases, non-graphical user interfaces can be very powerful, so it is important to be aware that you can actually also have non-graphical user interfaces, and it might be worth you doing a little bit of searching around to find out which applications that might be really relevant in. But in general, most user interfaces today are graphical. A very good example of a very successful and efficient user interface is actually Amazon's one-click. This has simplified the process of buying stuff from Amazon majorly. When Amazon first launched, there was no such thing as one click, and people had to go through a laborious process to buy things. Today, online retail is growing at faster than expected rate in the UK, and this is due in no small part to the fact that purchasing online has become much more simplified by things like one click. So now let's have a look at bad design. Why is this problematic? Can people just learn to use the software interface that you provide? Well, not really. 20 years ago maybe, but now people have a choice of the applications that they're going to use. So if your interface can't swing that choice in favour of you, then ultimately you're going to lose business. Bad design costs users time when trying to do common tasks. It costs companies money in lost income due to people being fed up with using their rubbish UIs. And in safety critical applications, poor UIs can also cost lives. If your user interface causes somebody to make a decision that is delayed by a certain time period, the implication of that could be very serious. How many times have you heard a family member complain about using a website to book travel or to do their banking? Poor UIs cause frustration and they put people off using your product. Here is an example of a poor UI designed by somebody for United Airlines, and actually the menus are completely bewildering, and it would have been much simpler to follow some basic design guidelines and avoid all of the mistakes listed on that slide. The really annoying and frustrating thing about this example is that simple design guidelines would have stopped the developers from making that UI unusable. I have tried to book a flight about a year ago using Virgin Atlantic's website through rewards schemes, because I had lots of rewards miles for Virgin Atlantic, and I wanted to book a multi-centre flight. It turned out I couldn't book that through the user interface at all. It was impossible. I got so annoyed that I went and booked the flight through Expedia instead. So that shows you that really my business was lost. Virgin Atlantic lost my business in that particular case because the UI didn't give me what I needed. So you can imagine that if your interface is a public-facing interface that people are using to purchase things, then it's really important that your interface does make it easy to do common things. In this, I like to think about things when designing a user interface in terms of, does it fail the granny test? If your granny can't use it, then most likely the interface isn't intuitive. There's no good reason why an older person or a younger child who is visually able can't use an interface. If the interface requires a huge amount of explanation to use, then it's poorly designed. HCI is becoming very big business. UIs sell products. An interesting case in point is when Apple, Samsung and Google entered the mobile phone handset market. They blew Nokia out of the water. At the time, Nokia was the industry leader in mobile phone handsets. A particular leaked memo from Nokia, from the CEO of Nokia, really conveys the problem in a really apparent way. He said in this memo that the first iPhone shipped in 2007. We still don't have a product that's close to their experience. Android came on the scene just over 2 years ago, and this week they took our leadership position in smartphone volumes. Unbelievable. That shows how important the UI is. The UI sells your product. So let's illustrate the problem caused by a little thought experiment. It's not massively scientific, but it's making a point. So let's say that on average, when using software every day, little tiny UI frustrations cost a person approximately 10 minutes of their time per day. Now, if we multiply this up by the number of days in a year and convert this to hours per person, we can say that these little frustrations add up to approximately 60 hours per person year. Now, if we multiply this up to the population of the United Kingdom, then this amounts to approximately 3.76 billion wasted hours per year. Now imagine that this relates in some way to money. We can't really guess at what this exact relationship would be, but if you think about the amount of UI frustrations that people might face in their daily job, that lost time is wasted money. And that wasted time costs the economy money. The best user interfaces are really those that become transparent and that they're so intuitive that we just understand how to use them without any help. Our attention then shifts to doing the task rather than figuring out how to fight the interface. Touch interfaces are a brilliant example of such transparent interfaces, and the seminal work in the area was done by Jeff Hunn in 2006, and more or less very soon after that they became widely available in consumer devices. Just look at your smartphone or tablet. However, keep in mind that this isn't really the only way to do it. So just because touch interfaces are really important at present, who knows what's coming 5 years down the line, or indeed 10 years down the line. When we design for people, it's really important to keep in mind a number of points, and that is that we need to understand what tasks people will want to do with the interface and how best to make it easy for people to accomplish those tasks. In particular, what are the common tasks they're going to do? How do we make that easy to do? What are the less common tasks? And is it all right to sacrifice some efficiency for the less common tasks but expose the more common tasks very visibly in the interface? This means that you have to work with users to understand the context of the application. You need to evaluate from the user's perspective and not your perspective as an engineer. You need to understand how they're going to use the interface. You have to pay attention to a range of user abilities that you need to cater for, and you need to talk to the experts. All the stakeholders involved in the process will need to be consulted, otherwise your design will be biased, quite possibly for the wrong audience. For example, if you talk only to management, then you might come up with an interface that management think needs to be deployed in the business, but it's not necessarily an interface that will work for the users that are going to use it on a daily basis. So you have to make sure that you talk to all the right people in the process. So some useful guidelines when developing user interfaces are Jacob Nielsen's usability heuristics. You should look at this in more detail, but briefly, Nielsen outlines 10 very practical rules of thumb to follow. And if you follow these practical rules of thumb, you won't make major user interface mistakes in your design. You probably still won't get the design perfect, and you still need to consult with people. You still need to think more creatively about the sorts of interfaces that might be necessary for the application, but you won't make really big, huge, glaring errors like the United Airlines online website I showed earlier. Now, I like to end every lecture with a teaser of the in-class practical task, and I'd like you to think about this task, because in class, in your teams, I'm going to get you to actually work on them and present your results to everybody in the class. See you next time.